literally freezing to death. In summer, the searing heat saps the energy and fluid from young bodies to the point of dehydration. There's no running water and very limited access to healthcare and education. The detainees in Al-Hol comprise a mix of local refugees who fled their homes during the reign of terror inflicted on the region by ISIS, and the families of the last remnants of the ISIS combatants themselves. The latter are housed in a separate annex from the main camp to allow the Kurdish authorities to keep a close eye on them and to protect them from those whose families and lives were destroyed by their brethren. I knew little about Kamalle at this point, except that his daughter and grandchildren were detained in Al-Hol, and that Kamalle had become the de facto leader of those Australian families with loved ones in Al-Hol. It's not a role that anyone would choose to take on. Yet, perhaps by virtue of his standing in the community and his long-held leadership of the Western Sydney Migrant Resource Centre, Kamalle was an obvious choice. At Save the Children, a robust discussion on whether to engage in an advocacy campaign on behalf of the children and families in Al-Hol had led to this meeting. We had debated the pros and cons of leaning into an issue that was divisive for many Australians. Politicians from the Prime Minister down had already done their best to position the fate of these women and children as an issue that should garner little sympathy from ordinary Australians. After all, it was suggested, what parent in their right mind would enter a war zone with young children, let alone as a sympathiser to a brutal ideology that had shocked the world with its acts of terror? Who could forget the image of the son of Australian ISIS combatant, Khalid Sharoof, holding the severed head of a Syrian soldier? And yet, it was the very complexity and wickedness of this problem that in the end made our choice to campaign for the repatriation of these children and their families an easy one. Save the Children was founded over 100 years ago on the simple premise that all children are innocent and that, by virtue of their fundamental and inalienable human rights, all children deserve our protection and support. Our founder was a suffragette named Eglantine Jebb, who famously campaigned to feed the enemy's children, who were starving as a result of the Allied blockade of Eastern Europe at the end of the First World War. In modern times, and when faced with uncertainty, we at Save the Children now tend to ask ourselves, what would Eglantine do? In the case of the Australian women and children stranded in Al-Hol, the answer was obvious. Regardless of how people view the actions of parents, and mainly men, who may have willingly put their families at risk, all children are innocent. The Australian children had already suffered unimaginable horror and were now stranded at the mercy of a Kurdish regime who didn't want them and an Australian government who didn't seem to care. In the case of the Australian women themselves, things were seemingly more complicated. I had read and followed the stories of the jihadi brides of ISIS, and as I walked drenched into that mascot restaurant in 2019, I had some nagging uncertainty as to what I would find. Was Kamalle's daughter innocent, as she so strongly attested? Was there a chance that, given the fate of his daughter, Kamalle may have unwittingly contributed to some sort of radicalization that led Mariam to enter Syria with her young family? But when I set eyes on Kamalle Dabboussy, I was instantly reassured. His first act was to insist on buying us a generous lunch, despite my assurances that we had just eaten and had limited time before needing to catch a plane. And from that moment on, what I heard and saw in Kamalle was a man whose life was punctuated by a singular, enduring truth: his love for his daughter, which drove an unflinching campaign to bring her home. Over the following 2 years, few weeks would go by when I didn't speak to or message Kamalle.